Zoe stood by the riverbank, her heart pounding in her chest, staring at her reflection in the water. The sun was setting, casting a soft glow across the village, but she couldn't find peace. Her thoughts were consumed by Kojo, his laughter, his bold ideas, the way his hand felt against hers. She knew it was wrong. At least, everyone told her it was wrong. Loving him was a betrayal, not just to her family but to everything her brother Ode stood for. She clenched her fists, feeling the cool breeze on her skin. Ode. Her protector, her brother, the one who had raised her after their parents passed. He had always been there, filling the gap left by death, watching over her like a hawk, guiding her future with strict hands. But now, it felt like he was a cage. His love came with rules, with expectations she couldn't live up to. Ode had always been clear, her future was tied to the village, to tradition, to marrying a man of their people. Kojo was none of those things. Kojo was from the city. He had come to the village for work, and in him, Zuri saw a world beyond the dusty roads and thatched roofs she had known all her life. His eyes spoke of freedom, of choices, of a life where she wasn't bound by her brother's rigid rules. Their love was secret, whispered in stolen moments by the river, under the cover of night when no one could see. But secrets have a way of leaking out. She remembered the first time Kojo had touched her hand. It was innocent enough, a brush of his fingers against hers. Yet, it was electric, sparking a fire she hadn't known was inside her. Every time they met, it became harder to pretend she didn't want more. They spoke of dreams, of leaving the village together, of living a life that was theirs and no one else's. She wanted it, desperately, but Ade's shadow loomed over every word. Zai. Ade's voice snapped her back to the present. She quickly stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. He was coming toward her, his face hard, suspicion clouding his eyes. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice low but tense. "I was here, by the river," she lied, hoping he wouldn't notice the slight tremble in her voice. Her heart raced, but she forced a smile. Ode stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I heard you've been seeing that boy again." Her stomach dropped. She had been careful. How had Ode found out? She looked away, her throat tight, unable to face the intensity of his gaze. "I told you once," Ode said, his voice quiet but full of warning. "I will not say it again. That boy is not for you. You have a duty to this family, to this village. Do you understand?" Zuri nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, but the words that burned inside her never made it out. She wanted to scream, to tell him that she didn't care about duty, that she loved Kojo, that she wanted a life of her own. But the weight of Ade's authority, his expectations, silenced her. She had never dared to defy him before. That night, Zuri lay in her small room, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Ade's warning echoed in her ears, but so did Kojo's voice. "We could leave. Run away together." He had said it only the night before, holding her close by the river, his breath warm against her skin. The idea had thrilled her, but fear kept her from saying yes. Where would they go? How could she leave Ode behind, leave the only life she had ever known? The next few days were torture. Ode watched her every move, his suspicion never fading. Every time she thought of slipping away to see Kojo, she felt his eyes on her, burning with judgment. Her chest tightened with every passing hour. She was suffocating. One evening, she couldn't take it anymore. She found Kojo waiting for her at their usual spot by the river, his face lighting up when he saw her. But Zoe didn't smile. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Ode, he knows. He'll never let me go." Kojo's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Then we leave." Now. Tonight. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. Leave. Just like that. Her heart ached with the thought of abandoning her brother, the man who had raised her, sacrificed so much for her. But Kojo was right. Ode would never let her live her own life. As long as she stayed, she would be trapped in his world, his rules. Before she could respond, she heard a rustling in the bushes behind them. Panic surged through her. Had Ode followed her? She turned quickly, her heart pounding, but saw nothing. Still, the unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, that soon, the choice would no longer be hers to make. Later that night, Ode confronted her. He had heard more rumors, more whispers about her and Kojo. His anger was palpable, filling the small room where they stood. "You think I don't know what's going on?" he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "You've been meeting him again. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" Zoe trembled, but something inside her snapped. "I love him, Ode," she said, her voice breaking. "I love him, and I won't stop seeing him." The silence that followed was heavier than anything she had ever felt. Ode stared at her, disbelief in his eyes, before it turned to fury. "If you choose him, you are no longer my sister," Ode spat, his words sharp and cold. "You will have no place in this family, in this village. Do you understand?" Zoe's heart shattered. She had always feared this moment, but hearing the words out loud made it real. The choice was clear: Kojo or her family. Her future or her past. Ade's control or her freedom. Tears streamed down her face as she turned away from her brother, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She could feel his eyes on her, but she couldn't look back. Every step away from him felt like a step towards something irreversible. That night, Zoe knew there was no turning back. Her love for Kojo had crossed a line, and Ade's wrath had left her with no other option. Zoe sat alone in the corner of her small room, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, her mind racing with thoughts she could barely control. The weight of her decision was suffocating, and yet, she felt trapped. Every breath was heavy, filled with the sharp sting of fear and guilt. She couldn't go on like this, living under Ade's shadow, under his constant control. She loved her brother, but his iron grip on her life felt like a prison. And Kojo. Kojo was the key to her escape, the only thing keeping her from drowning in despair. That night by the river, when Kojo first mentioned the plan, her heart had stopped. His words had been cold, calculated, and yet there was a strange comfort in the way he spoke about it. "We have no other choice," he had said, his voice barely a whisper over the sound of the rushing water. "Ode will never let you go, Zoe. We can't run, he'll find us. He'll never stop." She had known, deep down, that Kojo was right. Even if they ran, Ode would come after them, dragging her back, destroying everything she and Kojo dreamed of. Pride was everything to her brother. In his eyes, Zoe wasn't just his sister, she was a symbol of his family's honor, of their traditions. He wouldn't let her disgrace him by running off with a man from the city, a man who didn't share their blood or their customs. But killing him? The thought churned in her stomach like poison. She couldn't shake the image of Ade's face, his fierce eyes softening in rare moments of tenderness, the way he had taken care of her after their parents died. She loved him. He was the only family she had left. Yet that same love felt like a chain around her neck, tightening with every day she remained under his control. The more she tried to ignore the thought, the stronger it became. It haunted her, twisting her dreams into nightmares where Ade's eyes bore into her, accusing, judging, until she woke up breathless, her skin drenched in sweat. She couldn't think of a way out. Her heart longed for freedom, for Kojo's embrace, for a life where she could make her own choices. But her mind screamed at her, reminding her that to gain that freedom, she would have to pay the highest price. Days passed, and with each one, the tension between her and Ode grew thicker. He barely spoke to her anymore, his silent disapproval weighing heavily in every glance he cast her way. Then, without warning, he made his decision. Zoe's future, once again, was being decided without her. One evening, Ode called her into the house, his face set in stone. "You will marry Tand," he said, his voice final. "He is a respected man in the village. You will be well taken care of." Zoe's heart dropped. Tan was old enough to be her father, a widower with 2 grown children. She couldn't bear the thought of being his wife, of living a life even further removed from the freedom she craved. It felt like her soul was being suffocated. "No," Zoe whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. Ade's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "I said no," Zoe repeated, louder this time, her voice trembling. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall. For a moment, Ode said nothing. Then, with a sudden, terrifying rage, he slammed his hand down on the table, causing Zoe to flinch. "You will do as I say," he roared. "You are my sister, and I will not have you disgrace this family. You will marry Tand, and that is final." Zoe fled from the house, tears streaming down her face. She didn't stop running until she reached the river, where Kojo was waiting for her, his eyes full of worry. "I can't do it," she sobbed, collapsing into his arms. "He's forcing me to marry Tand. He'll never let me live my own life." Kojo's face hardened. "Then there's no other way, Zoe. We have to do it. We have to get rid of him." Zoe pulled back, shaking her head. I can't kill my own brother." "You won't have to," Kojo said softly, but his words were as cold as the night air. "I'll do it. But you have to help me. We'll make it look like an accident. No one will ever know." Zoe's chest tightened as the words sank in. Could she really let this happen? Could she stand by and watch the only family she had left be taken from her, all for the sake of her freedom? Her mind was a storm of guilt and terror, but beneath it all, there was a glimmer of something else, hope. Hope that, once Ode was gone, she and Kojo could finally be free. The decision weighed on her like a boulder, but in the end, the thought of being trapped in a life she didn't choose, a life without Kojo, was too much to bear. She nodded, her hands trembling. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll help you." The days that followed were a blur of quiet plans, whispered in secret corners, under the cover of darkness. Every word felt like a betrayal, every step closer to the act felt like stepping into a pit of no return. But Zoe pushed those feelings down, burying them beneath the growing desperation for freedom. She had to believe that this was the only way, that once it was done, she would finally be free of the suffocating weight of her brother's control. Each time she looked into Ade's eyes, the guilt gnawed at her, threatening to consume her whole. But then, she would think of Kojo, of the life they could have together, far from the village, far from the rules and expectations that bound her. And the guilt would shrink, replaced by a cold resolve. The day grew closer. Zoe could hardly breathe as the reality of what they were about to do settled in. She avoided Ode as much as she could, afraid that he would somehow sense her betrayal, that he would see the plan etched across her face. But he didn't. He went about his days, oblivious to the storm gathering just out of sight. The night before the plan was set to unfold, Zoe sat by the river again, alone. Her hands were shaking, her chest tight with fear and uncertainty. The water flowed calmly before her, as if mocking the chaos inside her. She felt the tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. There was no turning back now. She had made her choice. The night air was thick and heavy, pressing down on Zoe as she moved silently through the house. Her hands trembled as she prepared Aid's meal, her fingers brushing against the small pouch Kojo had given her earlier that day. The powder inside was enough to make him drowsy, weak, just enough to make what was about to happen easier. She couldn't stop thinking about it, the plan, the finality of it all. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the fear and guilt swirling in her mind. The village festival had begun hours ago, and the distant sounds of music and laughter drifted through the open window, a cruel reminder that life was going on as usual, even as she stood on the edge of a decision that would change everything. Zoe's hands shook as she sprinkled the powder into the stew, stirring it slowly, watching the liquid swirl as if it could somehow wash away what she was about to do. Ode would be home soon. The thought sent a chill down her spine. For a moment, she stood still, gripping the edge of the counter, her breath shallow. She could still stop this. She could throw the food away, tell Kojo they couldn't go through with it. But as soon as that thought entered her mind, she pushed it away. There was no turning back now. She had made her choice. The door creaked open, and Zoe's body tensed. Ode entered, his broad shoulders casting a shadow in the dimly lit room. He smiled when he saw her, a rare softness in his eyes that made Zoe's stomach twist with guilt. "You're still awake?" he asked, his voice tired but gentle. "I thought you might be hungry," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her throat felt tight, as though the guilt had lodged itself there, refusing to let go. Ode sat down at the small wooden table, unaware of the darkness creeping closer. Zoe placed the bowl in front of him, forcing a smile that felt like a lie on her lips. As Ode took his first bite, Zoe watched, her heart racing, her hands clutched together under the table. Each spoonful felt like a countdown, ticking away the moments until everything changed. "I haven't had your cooking in a while," Ode said between bites, his tone light, unaware. "It reminds me of when we were younger." Zoe nodded, unable to speak. Her chest ached with a mixture of sorrow and fear, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her like a crushing stone. She tried to avoid looking into Aid's eyes, but every time she glanced at him, her guilt grew stronger. He was her brother. He had raised her, protected her, and yet, here she was, sitting across from him, knowing this was the last meal he would ever eat. Minutes passed, and Zoe noticed Aid's eyelids beginning to droop. His movements slowed, his speech slurred slightly. "I feel strange," he murmured, rubbing his eyes. "Maybe I'm just tired." Zoe stood quickly, her chair scraping against the floor as she moved toward him. She had to get him to the place where Kojo was waiting. Her heart raced as she helped him to his feet, her hands trembling as she guided him toward the back door. Each step felt like a betrayal, a twisting knife in her gut. "I help you lie down outside," she whispered, her voice tight. "The fresh air might help." Ode mumbled something in agreement, too drowsy to question her. As they reached the small clearing behind the house, Zoe's breath hitched. The darkness of the night seemed to press in on her, suffocating. Kojo was there, hidden in the shadows, waiting. Zoe's heart pounded in her chest, each beat loud in her ears. She could feel the weight of the moment crushing her, squeezing her lungs. Ode slumped down onto the ground, his back resting against the trunk of a large tree. His head lolled to the side, and Zoe could see the confusion in his eyes, as if he knew something was wrong but couldn't quite understand what. And then it happened. Kojo moved swiftly from the shadows, a glint of steel in his hand. Zoe froze, her breath catching in her throat. It all happened too fast, yet at the same time, everything seemed to slow down. Kojo raised the blade high, his eyes cold and determined. Zoe opened her mouth to scream, to stop him, but no sound came out. Her legs felt like they were glued to the ground, her body paralyzed by fear and guilt. The blade came down with a sickening thud. Aid's eyes shot open, wide with shock and pain. Blood blossomed across his chest, dark and thick, soaking into his clothes. Zoe's heart shattered in that moment, the sound of the knife piercing her brother's flesh echoing in her ears. Ode gasped, his body jerking as he tried to understand what was happening. His hand reached out, grasping weakly at the air, his fingers brushing against Zoe's. She looked into his eyes, those eyes that had always watched over her, protected her, loved her. In that split second, she saw the realization dawn on him. He knew. He knew it was her. The betrayal in his gaze was like a blade through her own heart, sharper than anything Kojo held. Aid's lips moved, but no words came out. His eyes, full of pain and disbelief, locked onto hers, as if asking why, as if begging for an answer she could never give. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling as life slowly ebbed from him. Zoe couldn't move. Her legs were shaking, her body frozen in place. She watched as Aid's hand slipped from hers, falling lifelessly to the ground. His eyes stayed open, staring at her with that final, heartbreaking look of betrayal. The world around her seemed to stop. The festival music in the distance faded into nothing. All she could hear was the sound of her own ragged breathing, the rapid thudding of her heart, and the horrible silence that followed Aid's last breath. Kojo wiped the blood from his blade, his face expressionless. "It's done," he whispered, but Zoe didn't respond. She couldn't tear her eyes away from Aid's body, from the stillness of his chest, from the blood that pooled around him, staining the earth beneath. It was over. But as Zoe stood there, staring at what she had done, the weight of her choice crushed her. Aid's eyes, frozen in that final moment of betrayal, would haunt her forever. Zoe's hands were caked with dirt, trembling as she clawed at the earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The night was pitch black, only the faint moonlight cutting through the trees, casting ghostly shadows across the forest floor. Kojo worked silently beside her, his face cold and focused, but Zoe's mind was in chaos. She could still feel Aid's eyes on her, those final moments playing over and over in her head like a nightmare she couldn't escape. The hole wasn't deep enough, but Kojo said it would have to do. Time was running out. The village festival wouldn't last much longer, and people would notice Aid's absence soon. They dragged his body into the shallow grave, the sight of his lifeless form twisting Zoe's stomach. The sound of dirt hitting his chest sent shivers down her spine, each thud echoing the weight of her guilt. Kojo finished first, wiping his hands on his shirt, his voice steady as he whispered, "It's done." But it didn't feel done to Zoe. As they hurried back to the village, her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Kojo, who walked ahead, his face set in cold determination. How could he be so calm? Didn't he feel the same suffocating guilt she did? Didn't he see Aid's eyes every time he blinked? They arrived at the edge of the village, blending into the crowd as though nothing had happened. The music still played, people still danced, unaware that death now hung in the air like a dark cloud. Zoe tried to act normal, but her body was trembling, her face pale. She felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her, even though no one was looking. She heard the whispers in her head, though the people around her were laughing. Everything was normal, but inside, nothing felt right. The days that followed were worse. Zoe barely slept, and when she did, her dreams were filled with Aid's face, his eyes wide with betrayal, his lips moving silently, asking her why. She couldn't answer. She couldn't breathe. She would wake up gasping, her body drenched in sweat, her heart racing in terror. Every day she saw him, when she looked in the mirror, when she passed by his room, even when she closed her eyes. Kojo tried to reassure her, but his words felt hollow. No one will ever know, he kept saying. We did what we had to do. But Zoe wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure about anything. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, an unrelenting ache that never went away. She couldn't eat, couldn't laugh, couldn't even smile without feeling like she was betraying Ode all over again. Every shadow looked like him, every whisper carried his voice. And soon, the questions began. At first, they were small, casual remarks about where Ode might have gone, why he hadn't been seen at the festival. But the village was small, and word spread quickly. People started to wonder, and the whispers grew louder. Zoe could feel them, even when she wasn't around. She saw the looks people gave her, their eyes lingering just a little too long, their smiles just a little too forced. One evening, the village chief came to the house, his face stern, his eyes filled with suspicion. It's been days, Zoe, he said, his voice low. Where is your brother? Zoe swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She had rehearsed the lie so many times, but now the words felt heavy in her throat, thick with the weight of her guilt. He left the festival early, she stammered. I thought he went to visit our cousin in the next village. The chief's eyes narrowed, his silence more suffocating than any words he could have said. He nodded slowly, but Zoe could tell he wasn't convinced. The elders had already started asking questions, and soon they would want answers. The pressure built with each passing day. Zoe's skin crawled with the weight of her secret, her mind unraveling piece by piece. She couldn't escape it. Everywhere she turned, she saw reminders of Ode. His clothes still hung in the house, his belongings untouched. She could hear his voice, low and firm, telling her what to do, how to be. The more she tried to forget, the louder his voice became. And then, one afternoon, as Zoe walked through the village market, an old woman stopped her. She was hunched over, her eyes clouded with age, but her voice was strong, piercing through the noise around them. The spirits know the truth, child, she said, her words slow and deliberate. You cannot hide from them. Zoe's blood turned to ice. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the old woman. What do you mean? She whispered, though she already knew. The woman's gaze bore into her, as if she could see straight through Zoe, into the dark, twisted place where her guilt lived. They always know. And they will not be silent. Zoe stumbled away, her heart pounding in her chest. The old woman's words echoed in her mind, repeating themselves over and over until she thought she would scream. She rushed back to the house, her hands shaking, her body trembling with fear. Kojo was there, waiting for her, his face calm as always, but Zoe couldn't take it anymore. They know, she gasped, collapsing into a chair. They know, Kojo. Kojo frowned, his calm demeanor finally cracking just a little. Who? What are you talking about? The spirits, the old woman. She said they know. She said we can't hide. Kojo's jaw clenched, but he quickly shook his head, his voice firm. She's just an old woman, Zoe. She's trying to scare you. No one knows. But Zoe wasn't so sure. The weight of what they had done was too much to bear. The guilt was suffocating, pressing down on her from every direction. She could feel it in the air, in the stares of the villagers, in the quiet moments of the night when she was alone with her thoughts. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers grew louder. The village chief visited again, and this time, he brought the elders with him. Their questions were sharper, their eyes more suspicious. Zoe could feel the walls closing in around her, the weight of her lies crushing her with every passing day. Kojo tried to remain strong, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his eyes. The guilt was starting to get to him too, and Zoe could see it. The way his hands shook when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his voice wavered just slightly when he spoke about Ode. The pressure was building. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Zay lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing in the quiet of the night. The room felt too small, the air too thick, and every creak of the house made her jump. She hadn't slept properly in weeks, haunted by dreams that left her breathless and drenched in sweat. Each night, she saw Ode. His eyes, wide and accusing, his lips moving but making no sound. She could hear his footsteps in the forest, could feel his presence in the shadows of her room. The whispers had begun a few nights ago, soft at first, almost like the wind, but growing louder with each passing day. At first, Zay thought it was her imagination, her guilt playing tricks on her mind. But now, she wasn't so sure. They were too real, too persistent. They came from the trees outside her window, from the dark corners of her house. And always, they called her name. Zay. She sat up in bed, her body trembling. The darkness around her seemed to pulse, alive with something she couldn't understand. The old woman's words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of what she'd done. The spirits know the truth. Zay didn't believe in such things before, but now she wasn't so sure. How could she be, when she felt Ade's presence everywhere? She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her heart pounding in her chest. Outside, the wind howled, but beneath it, she heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving through the forest. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The footsteps were closer now, circling the house, stopping just beneath her window. Zay couldn't take it anymore. She rushed outside, into the dark night, her bare feet sinking into the damp earth. Ode, she cried, her voice shaky, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Leave me alone. Please. But there was no response, only the eerie rustle of leaves in the wind. She felt the weight of the forest pressing in on her, the shadows twisting and shifting as if someone was watching. The next morning, Kojo found her sitting by the fire, her eyes distant, her hands trembling. He hadn't been around much lately, disappearing for long stretches without explanation. Zay barely noticed his absence anymore, she was too consumed by her own unraveling mind. We should leave, Kojo said, breaking the silence. The village is becoming dangerous for us. Zay looked up at him, her heart sinking. What do you mean? Kojo's face was unreadable. People are talking. The elders are asking too many questions. It's only a matter of time before they come for us. We should go, Zay. Start over. In the city, no one will know who we are. Zay's stomach twisted. You want to run? Kojo's eyes flickered with something cold. It's the only way. We can't stay here. Zay stared at him, the realization hitting her like a punch to the chest. He wasn't doing this for them. He was doing this for himself. All this time, she had thought Kojo loved her, that he had wanted to free her from Ade's control. But now she saw the truth. Kojo hadn't cared about her. He had used her to get rid of Ode, to clear the path for his own selfish desires. You don't care about me, Zay whispered, her voice shaking. You never did. Kojo didn't deny it. His silence was answer enough. The betrayal stung, but it didn't surprise her. Not anymore. Everything was falling apart, just as she had feared it would. The old woman's words returned, stronger than before. The spirits know. You cannot hide from them. Zay's heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, the weight of everything pressing down on her, suffocating. She couldn't run. She couldn't leave. Not with Ade's spirit haunting her every step, not with the guilt gnawing at her soul. Days passed in a blur, the tension in the village growing thicker. The elders were suspicious, and the villagers whispered behind Zoe's back. They knew something was wrong. They could feel it, just as she could. And then, one evening, the elders came. The village chief, the council, and the old woman with her piercing eyes that seemed to see into Zoe's soul. Zoe stood frozen as they entered her home, her heart racing, her hands clammy with fear. Kojo was nowhere to be seen. He had left earlier that day, and Zoe knew in her heart he wasn't coming back. The old woman stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Zoe. "The spirits have spoken," she said, her voice low and ominous. "They know what you have done." Zoe felt the blood drain from her face. Her legs felt weak, her body trembling as she tried to hold on to her crumbling composure. The old woman's eyes never left hers, and in that moment, Zoe knew there was no escaping this. "I didn't," Zoe began, but the words caught in her throat. She could feel Aid's presence in the room, suffocating her, pressing in from every direction. She couldn't breathe. The guilt, the fear, the whispers, they all swirled around her, tightening like a noose around her neck. "The spirits demand justice," the old woman continued, her voice a harsh whisper. "The truth will not remain hidden." Zoe's body shook violently as the old woman raised her hands, her voice rising in a chant, calling on the spirits to reveal what had been hidden. The air in the room grew thick, the temperature dropping as if death itself had entered. And then, Zoe saw him. Ode. Standing behind the old woman, his face pale, his eyes hollow, staring at her with the same look of betrayal he had in his final moments. Zoe screamed, stumbling back, her hands clutching her head as the guilt and fear finally broke her. "I did it," she cried, her voice cracking with the weight of her confession. "I killed him. I killed Ode." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking into the air. Zoe collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably, her body racked with guilt. She had tried to run from it, tried to hide, but the truth had found her. Aid's spirit had found her. The village chief stepped forward, his face grim. The elders surrounded her, but Zoe no longer cared. There was no escape from the haunting truth. Aid's eyes would follow her, even in her final breath.